Hello and welcome to Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. My name is Ben and with me is,
Jim.
or as I like to call him, Bruce. And this week we watched Jaws. It was a Ben pick. And Ben is happy with his pick.
I am actually also very happy with your pick this week, Ben. I've got lots to say on Jaws, more than I thought I would have to say. There's a lot with this movie. It's iconic. 1975, a lot going on. Since it's all you today, do you want to take it away with a synopsis?
Kick it off. Synopsis. I want you to know I respected this movie so much that I treated this synopsis with respect. And so much so that in ChatGPT I said, write a respectful synopsis. In the seaside town of Amity Island, a great white shark begins terrorizing beachgoers, leading Police Chief Brody to urge the mayor to close the beaches. Despite Brody's concerns, the beaches remain open. 'Cause money. Resulting in more deadly shark attacks. Brody teams up with a marine biologist, Hooper, and a shark hunter, Quint, to track down and kill the shark. After several tense encounters at sea, the shark sinks their boat, killing Quint. And in a final showdown, Brody destroys the shark by shooting an oxygen tank lodged in its mouth, bringing peace back to Amity Island. I didn't go super in depth with it deliberately because actually not a lot happens in this movie.
No, it's
and it's the beauty of it.
It is. And that's part of. I want to talk to you about the structure of it in a second, but I imagine you've got some stats for us as well.
We do. As Jim said earlier, released 1975, directed by Steven Spielberg of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, Jurassic Park, and the Adventures of Tintin fame. Screenplay by Peter Bletchley, who wrote the book, and Carl Gottlieb. Cinematography, which I bring up deliberately because there's some cool stuff in this movie. Bill Butler. Music by the man, the legend, Jonathan Williams, or John Williams. Starring Roy Schneider as Brody, Robert Shaw as Quint, Richard Dreyfuss as Hooper, Lorraine Gary, and Murray Hamilton. Budget of $9 million, box office domestic $476.5 million. That may be the smallest budget to the biggest return that we've had on this podcast.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, look. And that's sort of starter's gun. We're off to the races now talking about Jaws. And that is a great place to start because
the invention of the summer blockbuster.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I was going to get into. This is the movie that launched, both a style of movie making as well as a style of marketing films and release schedules and how many screens you're actually going to want to, use for your theatrical release. This movie became the template because of its success. You could even argue they're still trying to replicate the success of Jaws today.
Well, I mean, you can even say we wouldn't have Star Wars unless we had Jaws. The direct marketing, the screens, the summer blockbuster stuff, it wouldn't have had the wide reach it initially had unless Jaws was its template first. This movie literally changed the game in multiple ways. And I didn't even realize that, summer movie times was seen as a death knell release for movies back in the day. People did not want to release in summer. It wasn't when you made movies. And that's so foreign and alien to me today, because that's the only time big movies come out.
It's also, though, because of the model that they were using pre-Jaws to actually release their films, it wasn't even locked to a time and place because wide releases were also really uncommon. They weren't going big with a big opening weekend that, was on all of the screens. They did these tiny sort of staggered releases. And this sounds kind of cute, the next thing I'm about to say, when you look at the modern movie-going landscape. But believe it or not, the movie's reach was then adapted based on, positive word of mouth and reviews. That's how quaint.
Crazy.
If people like it, we'll put it on more screens,
It was more of that traveling circus template. Films went town to town because they were literally film reels moving from town to town. And that's where you historically got those images that other directors later on in their life tried to copy, of like that degradation of film and that kind of those weird quirks you would get because the film had been played 1,000 times as it crossed the country. And
It, it is weird though, because like if you kind of look at what was going on at that time, look, Jaws gets. I think Jaws is a great movie. Like, and obviously so does everybody else. Do you know what I mean? Ever.
yeah,
Like this movie, everyone loves it. But at the same time, what we're talking about, in a way, I think that was actually inevitable. Jaws just happened to
yeah,
be the first hit, and it was such a huge hit that it really gets all of the praise for it. But like that, if you sort of look at, industry analysts at that time, the wide release was coming. It was
yeah.
something that had been tinkered with and dabbled with, and this just happened to be the first movie to really road test that on a big scale. But it it was, if it wasn't this, it would have been something else.
Yeah.
Like, because it was coming. People
I
knew it
mean,
was like a good
that's
way
the
to go.
story of history. Like, there's always a first, but if it wasn't that, it was always going to be something else.
Yeah.
Especially in cinema, because cinema is one of those innovative places. Like, people don't always like the innovation, like, or it's a limited like. But yeah, there's always that person who's trying to push something further. And to think that the summer blockbuster was an experiment is wild.
It's also, this is the film that launched Steven Spielberg as a
Yeah,
filmmaker. This was, he'd made, it's actually very difficult, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds. It's quite difficult to determine, to put a number on how many films Spielberg had made prior to Jaws, because Spielberg had this sort of interesting start where he was kind of working in TV, and he was
yeah.
kind of working, in he did a little bit of episodic stuff, and then he did some TV movies, and but we could say safely this was his second theatrical release. Um, you know,
Jewel?
no, Jewel wasn't actually. This is the tricky part with
Yeah.
Spielberg, right? Jewel was actually a made-for-TV movie, which then
Ah,
kind of got, because it was good. They got to do some reshoots and
yeah.
bump it up a little bit, and then eventually, after his later success, it got cinematically released and it got limited releases. But technically, his first, wider sort of cinematic release was a movie called Sugarland Express,
Ah,
which not a lot of people have seen,
I haven't seen it.
but
I know,
really
I've heard of it.
Jaws is it. This is the
Yeah.
number two, and it's the one that, sort of, and it's sorry, just going back. People forget about Sugarland Express all the time. People go Jewel and then Jaws and then
Yeah,
Close
that
Encounters,
was
and it's
my
like,
thoughts.
well, actually, like, but anyway, look, so this is the film that really introduced the wide global audience to Steven Spielberg, and he was here to stay. He's still here, still doing his movie making thing, all these decades later, and it's because of this awesome start that he had with Jaws.
It's interesting to see that he was always that kind of polymath of media, though, like TV, movies, back in the day when people really didn't cross those boundaries. He's since been involved in all sorts of media, music, video games. He's written books, all that sort of stuff. It's kind of, he is that generation of Lucas where these guys were just kind of like nerds who wanted to see stuff made, so they made it.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of cool. So we've spoken about how one way this movie is groundbreaking. The other way is the movie itself. It invented's a strong word, but it definitely popularized or cemented almost a genre of that kind of suspense, kind of horror-y kind of thing. But how would you describe what Jaws is as a movie? Because it's not horror. It's not.
No, it's a thriller, but what's really interesting about Jaws is that the prototype for Jaws is the work of Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah.
So, but Jaws is so different to the work of Alfred Hitchcock. And in a weird way, it's kind of not really the genre where Spielberg does most of his work, but it's as sort of in these early days for Spielberg, having a prototype, a model, something to hook onto while you're developing your own style. So in a weird way, you look at it and you go, oh, well, there's so many hallmarks of Hitchcock, even things like a film technique called the
Yeah.
contra zoom, with Brody on the beach. But even just the way the film is constructed and using that basic model of sort of a thriller, and you say, well, that's all Hitchcock, but the way Spielberg does it with such energy and with really an action and adventure sensibility, none of that was really in Hitchcock's work. So that's the part that is pure Spielberg, and that's really the part that audiences latched onto. And he would sort of leave the thriller angle behind and lean more wholly into that action adventure instinct for his later films.
Even as you said it, as a Spielberg movie, it's much more of a character piece than a lot of his other films. Like the big three in this film of Quint, Hooper, and Brody, like the scenes where they're talking on the boat, especially Quint, and like those kind of deep, dark moments of revelation of character. You get that in his other movies, but they don't really sit on them as long as they do in this movie, and emphasizing obviously the isolation on the ocean, and it's just them and the shark and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, like you're right, like obviously the hallmarks of what Steven Spielberg's career is here, but there's also stuff that he didn't always pull along with him.
Yeah, that's right. Like, but you got to start somewhere, and
Yeah.
it's you got to have some kind of model, or so, and it's interesting because if you look at the behind the scenes of the film, like that was something that and there's a lot. This is obviously like Hollywood history, Hollywood lore. Everyone knows,
There are
that
documentaries and documentaries on the making of this film.
so the shark didn't work properly is sort of the biggest way to put it, like and because of that, the plan to not show the shark as much really became something that they did out of necessity. So the film, much as you could sort of say, oh well, it was inspired by Hitchcock, it's like, well, in the making of it, it became much more inspired by Hitchcock out of necessity, so the two things kind of fed into each other as well. So but again, that's not a bad thing. That's perhaps part of its big success.
Well, it's film language I think I've even used on this podcast, where we say, hey, they really kind of did a Jaws by hiding the monster. They did a Jaws by hiding the thing. And you don't see the thing for the majority of the movie because as human beings, we are spectacular at using our imaginations. Even today, where people say we've lost it because of social media and networking and all that sort of stuff. But we're really good at imagining something better that we can be shown. And that's shown nowhere better than the movie Jaws. Like, it's way scarier imagining what's under the water, just seeing the fin. And back in the day, it would have been different. When you see it now, you're obviously like, oh, big fake shark. But
I'm gonna
it's still
stop
pretty
you
good.
there. I don't see the big fake shark thing. Obviously, it's something where, look, if we actually go, my relationship to Jaws, and I was surprised actually at how much of this movie I either A, just haven't seen, or B, haven't seen in so long that I've completely forgotten it. Like, Jaws is something where even just, I remember on the end of the last cast where I was like, oh yeah, Jaws, love Jaws. And then when I actually sat down to watch it, I was like, I don't remember huge like chunks of this film. And I'm like, have I even seen that? Like, there are parts of it that, I teach, in as film and television lore and history. So there are scenes that I know very, very well, but it's been a very long time since I sat down and actually watched the whole thing right the way through. And I was sort of pleasantly surprised by so much of what I found. And what I found was, I think, and this is controversial, I think the shark looks great, right? Do you know what I mean? I actually think it looks great. Like, I was looking at it going, it's big talk in, everywhere. Oh, the shark's fake. The shark looks terrible. I'm like, I don't think it looks terrible. I think it looks like a big shark.
You're right. It's not terrible. It's just, as I said, it's like when you finally see it, you're like, oh, I can see it doesn't have a lot of movement. Like, that's the thing, right? Like, it doesn't look fully alive. It looks really good.
And I think what actually caused me to stop the film, no, actually, sorry, I didn't stop the film, but after the film, I went and did a bit of digging, was some of the shots, they use real sharks. And that also really surprised me because I was like, again, in my head, I'm like, big fake shark, big fake shark, big fake shark. And then there are a few underwater shots, and I'm like, no, that's a real shark. And cutting them together, I think, really does a good job of hiding the fact that their fake shark, if you like, who is affectionately known in the industry as Bruce, like it just certainly makes it look better, having those shots of the real shark in there. And again, I was very surprised actually looking at the film going, oh, that's a real shark. Oh, that's a real shark. Like it's like, hang
You like to
on,
do
like
that?
there's not that much fake shark in this movie. Like, or at least not as much as I sort of thought there was.
So the other piece of the puzzle that I actually think makes this a scary movie and the shark more believable is the score. The score and the music in this film is one of those iconic pieces. And it comes to us, as I said earlier, of John Williams' fame. Like, literally, it has been parodied and used and remixed and recreated a million times through history and other films and pop culture. Just the straight up dun 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 dun. Like, that stuff with the orchestral stuff behind it is maybe, I think, one of my favorite pieces of cinema now that I've rewatched this film. Like, what that does in this film is it turns, because it turns this movie into something that is special. Like, it has all the other ingredients, but without that score, without the seriousness that score that takes with itself, this movie isn't what it is. And I know that might sound silly, but like, I can imagine this score. I can imagine this film with a different score from the 1970s that's a bit more like hokey, and it becomes a B grade film. Like,
Well, much as this is the audience and the world's introduction to Spielberg, it's also our introduction to John
yeah,
Williams, who is such a huge part of Spielberg's enduring success over the decades that those two collaborated, And it's funny, if you look at that late 70s time period, it's really three guys all over it, and two of them are in this movie. Like, we've
yeah,
got Steven Spielberg, we got John Williams, and then 2 years after this, we get Spielberg and Williams again for Close Encounters of the Third Kind in 1977. And then the same year, we get George Lucas and Williams with Star Wars. And
yeah,
really, like, if you look at those three films, Jaws, Close Encounters, and Star Wars, John Williams is scoring all three of them. He's doing an amazing and iconic job, and that really cements these gentlemen as the top tier in blockbuster cinema, and simultaneously creates
yeah.
blockbuster cinema as well. So it's pretty cool to look back and sort of see how it all began. And the other thing is, like, it's nice to see a director and a composer who are, critically acclaimed and super famous, and then you go, yeah, deserving,
Yeah.
it's
They
you
make
can
good
have
things.
you can have all the accolades coming to you. Like, people weren't hyperbolic about it. This is good stuff, like it's really working.
Because you didn't really have, I mean, you had famous film composers, but Williams was the first big kind of, everyone knew his name. Like,
Yeah, and look,
of that generation. And then you get further on, you get the Zimmers and you get the Elfmans and you get all those sort of ones in between. But Williams was that first named composer.
well, the interesting thing there, and not to get too far off it, but like, it's really the Jaws score is good, but really it's the Star Wars
Yeah.
score, because that was then a full orchestra, and that
Yeah.
was the point of difference, because that was super old Hollywood, and people weren't doing that anymore. They were moving to starting to come into the 80s and getting into more computerized
Soundtracks.
sounds and synth and all that kind of stuff. And Williams and Star Wars was a total reaction to that in a way that just brought the whole orchestral feel to blockbusters that is still there today. But the other thing is, if you look at Jaws, so much of Spielberg's style is intact fully in
Yeah.
this film. Like, there's something in cinema called the Spielberg Wanna. Are you familiar? It's a little okay.
Explain it to me.
So the Spielberg Wanna is in movies. You might be familiar with a Wanna, which is where
Yes.
you have a shot that is a long shot that covers all the action in the scene. Usually the camera's moving around, but there's no cutting, right? And of course, people sort of one up each other with this directors, and they do very long shots, and you end up with films like 1917, where they're trying to make the whole film look like it's one continuous shot that never cuts, which it's not. Spoiler alert. But anyway,
They get tricksy.
but Spielberg, even way back here in 75, was doing his version of a one-er. And they're also called moving masters, which is this idea that you can, if you pick your angle correctly, you can actually capture all of the action in a scene in one shot, and you don't have to cut, and you don't have to cut into that shot. A really good example of it is when Brody's talking to the mayor and his entourage on the ferry, and the camera just sits there. The background changes because they're literally on the ferry, and then the blocking or the movement of the actors is the thing that gives the frame all of its life, and it was a really unusual thing to do then. And Spielberg did it right through his career, still does it to this day. A lot of directors try and do it and get it wrong. Because if you get it wrong, the pacing of your scene is fixed. Your pacing has to be great because you can't cut in with any other shots, particularly if you didn't film them. But this moving master, or this, the Spielberg one-er, it's funny, you look at it and go, oh, it's not something he developed over time. It's something he had from day one, pretty much, and it was something that he was doing, and he was doing well. And it was a point of difference between him and other directors, So, and a lot of his framing, with the idea that he often has characters in deep foreground, very close to the camera, and also characters in deep background, and they're having a dialogue scene together, which is just an unusual way to do things, but it's something that he does all the time in this movie, and then he does it all the time in his other movies. So
I literally pictured about 3 scenes from Jurassic Park where that happens.
Yeah. And another thing that you might note, and this is in Jurassic Park too, but it's here in Jaws, is Spielberg does a very unusual thing as a filmmaker where he has characters overlap their dialogue. He'll actually have, a good example in Jaws is the scene where Brody's in the kitchen. I think he's on the phone, and his wife and son are actually having a conversation in the background. Now, we're supposed to be focused on Brody on the phone, and they're in the background, but their dialogue is still in the mix together. And it's actually, the sound is overlapping, and it's like there's two things happening at once. And most filmmakers wouldn't do this because it really can confuse the audience. It can make things seem really messy. It's seen as bad filmmaking, but Spielberg's got this sense of rhythm and this sense of what is important in the scene, that when he stages these things, he's able to just make it feel organic and like a real kitchen scene. And you still get the right information at the right time, due to the way things are mixed and who's talking. And it's really a magic trick. And it's really a magic trick that, is only done through really, really quality direction, So, and it's all of these things and more we were seeing as far back as Jaws. And you look at Spielberg's entire career, and he does all of these things all the time, right the way through. So it's cool. It's just cool to watch a filmmaker arrive fully formed,
So the crux of this movie is obviously there's a shark and it eats people. Do you know how many people actually get eaten by the shark in this movie?
Yeah, it's 5, right?
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's crazy. If you'd asked me before I rewatched this film, I'd be like, 15, 20 eaten by the shark. Because that's what we're used to in modern films, right? Like, if you've got a threat and it's not eating a billion people, is it really a threat? And I just found it bamboozling that like 5 people died. Over the whole series of Jaws, I think the victim count is about 20.
I was actually, speaking of the victims, it's and particularly when we think about Spielberg as a filmmaker, this film's dark, and it's kind of weird.
Dark.
It's weird in the sense too, because it's like, it's got the lightness of the adventure tone of Spielberg, and we're out to get the shark and we're hunting it. But at the same time, it's like, when people die, they really
Mm.
die. And like, there's really dark stuff. Like one of the victims is a child. It's
Yeah.
awful. Like, and it's not something that it's funny because, yeah, sure, Jaws, a shark attack movie, you think, oh, well, it's going to be dark, but it's also associated with kind of fun. It's that fun idea. And then when you actually watch it and you're like, actually, it's just some of these there's nothing fun about that. That's just super dark. That's a dark thing to have happen. It's a dark way to show that thing happening. Like, which again, in a way, it shouldn't have taken me off guard. It's a shark attack movie, but it did, because I think I'm used to Spielberg as someone who does this lighter stuff. And there are sections of Jaws that are very light, but then
Mm.
every time one of these attacks happens, it's chilling. It's because of what could unfold.
Well, talking about darkness brings me to my favorite character in the film, which is Quint. Like, and as a kid, it would not have been Quint because he is crazy and scary and dark. But in this movie, Richard Shaw's performance, which behind the scenes, he was apparently a legitimate nightmare.
Robert Shaw, right?
Robert Shaw, what did I
Yeah.
say?
Richard Shaw.
Wow, Richard Dreyfuss, Robert Shaw. Yeah, Robert Shaw. But behind the scenes, he was a legit nightmare. Like, apparently he just bullied Richard Dreyfuss, like legit harassed him, and had a drinking problem, all that sort of stuff. But what he put on film, like, it's not a surprise. He'd done brilliant work before this film. But what he puts on film as Quint, especially that when he talks about when he was in the Navy and that ship gets sunk and they're sitting in the water and he goes through that really long, kind of engrossing story, and you're just like, this guy's insane. Like, this guy is a broken human who can't be fixed and is telling this story as an explanation of himself and a few other things. And you're just like, that was one of the most captivating parts of this movie to me. That story. And it's famous. Like, it's everywhere. It's been repeated in pop culture, even to funny extents and serious extents. But he was legitimately brilliant in this movie. Like, he is the actor in this film. And it shows.
I'd agree. Like, it's a great performance. It's a great character. And interestingly as well, I think what also surprised me about the film on, this viewing of it was once they sort of start to do the shark hunt, you sort of think, okay, cool, we're gearing up for the finale. We're not. We've got kind of half the movie left to go. Like,
we got Old Man in the Sea ×3.
Yeah,
like
so it's sort of, but that's great because that's the best stuff, like, and Robert Shaw is hardly in the first sort of half of the film, and then obviously it becomes the three-hander of Richard Dreyfuss, Robert Shaw, and Roy Scheider. I struggle so much with that one.
Scheider.
But like with those three on the boat, and that is really the heart of the film, and that's where all the good stuff is, if you like. Not that the first part's bad, it's just that's where it's really great scenes of those three together.
Well, the first part is really the first half of this movie is establishing, right? It's establishing Amity, it's establishing the shark, it's establishing this town who is just full of morons. Like my favorite villain in films are like ignorant people. And this one nails it with like ignorant and greedy people like, well, we can't close the beach. It's summer holidays and blah, blah, blah. And you're just like, oh my God. It's like the lady in the mist. I hate her too. Anyway, but yeah, like that's this establishing thing of like, you kind of getting to know Brody and getting to know kind of like he lives in this town and he quite obviously is a little bit of an outsider because he thinks practically.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then you get that three-hander and then you get that action at the end and it's a wonderful film that would never be made today. Like the pacing of this film is impossible to remake today. No one would even pay to make it.
It's not even just that. This film's so iconic. You can't make a film like this again unless you're going to spin it somehow or do something absurd and outlandish, which people do that all the time. Snakes on a plane. Snakes on a plane, anyone? Like,
Yeah. Well, even like The Meg and The Meg 2, like it's effectively a similar formula. Like big shark, eat people.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to bring up is there's someone who's involved with making this film who actually regrets the making of this film. Not fully, but a good half of it, and spent the rest of their life trying to correct something because of this film. Do you know about this?
It could be.
You
Are
probably
you?
know the concept of it. So
Yeah.
Peter Bletchley, the man who wrote the book and the first script of
Oh
this
yes.
film,
Wait, let me
uh,
do it. Let me do
yeah,
it.
go.
Is this about shark conservation?
It is about shark
Yeah. Okay.
conservation
Okay. Okay.
because
I
this
got it. I
film
got it.
has undisputably been linked to the death of
Yeah.
many, many sharks, and Bletchley was horrified by this because he's like, I just wanted to make a scary thing, and he loved the ocean. If you go back and look at all the works he did after Jaws, because Jaws was like his first thing as well, really. It was all about monsters in the sea or underneath the sea or all these sort of things. He loved the ocean. And he spent a good part of the rest of his life trying to. He released non-fiction books about how good sharks were and documentaries and all this sort of stuff because Jaws did create shark panic. It
Mm.
created it created a phobia that didn't exist, at least widespread didn't exist. Like people weren't deathly afraid of what was under the water in the same way before Jaws as they were after Jaws. Like it literally changed the the zeitgeist, the consciousness of the planet to fear sharks in the water. Like it's crazy. Yeah, and Bletchley was really bummed out about that. He's even got multiple like environmental awards named after him to this day.
Yeah, I had actually heard that, and obviously I knew that it was not good for marine life in general, Jaws, but again, that's just sort of speaks to the phenomenon of the film, like in a way that you just wouldn't see today. Like it's just this was like people like it played for months and months and months at cinemas, and people kept going to see it. Like it was just crazy how deeply this film like penetrated into society, if you know what I mean. Like,
Ideas in media don't last that long anymore. Ideas in media now are quick, they're flashes, and they're done and they're replaced
mm,
because the speed of media has changed. As you said, Jaws was out there. Jaws sat with people. People re-watched Jaws. Home video wasn't a thing. Like to watch that movie again, you had to go find another screening of Jaws, and people did. And as I said, like one of my favorite creators of all time, Kevin Smith, directly references Jaws for his fear of the ocean. Like
mhm.
it's fascinating stuff that it changed the psychology of a generation of people.
Yeah, I mean, but look, I'm stoked you picked this movie. I was very pleased to watch it again, or maybe for the first time. I don't know. Like, like I said at the
I have a
start of
theory
this
on
movie.
that. I think
Yeah.
because it's been repeated so many times in pop culture, and because specific moments get repeated in pop culture, those things get reinforced in your brain. And then when you go back and watch the whole movie, you're like, oh, all the bits in the middle, I don't remember those. It's because all the other stuff's been rammed down your throat for 50 years.
Yeah. True. True.
But yeah, that's my theory on that.
Look, it's probably what happened, but even for that reason alone, I'm
Yeah.
pleased that you're like, hey, let's watch Jaws. I'm like, yeah, all right, let's do that. So so look, I had a good time, and thanks for picking it.
Thanks for
I
watching it
think,
with me.
yeah, no problem. Would you like to hear where we're going next?
I would. I'm on a bit of a high, so I'm wanting you to keep that high going with this film. You
Oh
just
yeah,
smiled. I don't think you're going to.
you want me to keep the high going? Well, look, we watched something that was of a high quality with Jaws.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I want to keep the fun and the sense of energy, but we are going to take quite a hit to the quality of what we're doing next. I I just wanted to watch this one, Ben, and it makes me smile when I think about it. And we're watching Talk from 2004.
I should have seen it coming. I really should have. I really should have. We watch the same videos on YouTube. We're part of the same conversations. And if I'd stopped for 10 seconds,
Yeah.
10 seconds, I would have picked it. Oh,
Look, it's no.
I've never seen it.
Oh,
So,
what? You've never
nope,
seen it?
never
Look,
seen it. And I
it's
think I'm
no
better off
Jaws.
for it.
It's no Jaws, Ben. Okay, I'll say that right now.
So just to
But
clarify, it's talk, as in like talk of gears, right? Not TLK.
as in torque wrench. Yep.
Yep.
TORQUE. And look,
It's a motorcycle racing
I'm
combat
so
movie.
pleased that you've never seen
Never
it.
seen it. I could have gone my whole life, but you ruined that.
No, I think look, if we get nothing else out of this podcast, having you watch Talk makes it all worth it. Do you know what I mean? Like if nothing else was to happen, being like one more person on this planet has seen Talk, like
Damn you,
um,
Corridor Digital.
you're gonna love it. You're gonna love it. Like,
Well, I hope I do. I hope I genuinely love it. So, homework for next week is Talk. Go out, watch it. I'm going to. Yay! Thank you for joining us for Jaws, and thank you for joining us in the podcast. If you want to listen to our podcast, you can do so in a couple of places. Obviously, Spotify and iTunes. Just looking up Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. You can find us on the YouTubes, Jim and Ben's Movie Adventures. And on social media, which I do plan on expanding soon and will hopefully announce in a podcast to come. At the moment, though, you can find us on Instagram at Jim_and_Ben. Thank you so much for being with us this week, and thank you, Jim, for picking Talk for next week. Wow. So excited. Have a great one, everyone. Thank you so much.
bye.